All right.
Absolutely.
So I have hello everyone, I'm Pat Mitchell, and thank you so much for joining us for this session. And I suspect we're going to have people coming in the back to join us because being the first session after lunch, we have to keep you awake, and we also have to recognize some people are going to be late. But here are the rules that I am asked to share from the Skoll Foundation. Silence all cell phones, please. Feel free to use social media sites throughout the session. However, the Twitter hashtag is hashtag SkollWF. Announce when you're taking questions, please tell us who you are and use the hand mics, which will be circulated. And I like getting as interactive as we possibly can, so we'll probably go to the audience for questions early on. If I don't see you, feel free to shout or in any way get my attention. I don't have a seat, so I'm going to be pacing back and forth. The session is being filmed, so I assume everyone that needs to know knows you're here. And if you have the Skoll World Forum, never know. So if you have the Skoll World Forum mobile app, please check in on this session so that we know who's in the room. That would be important for all of us. So I have a quote, and I am violating the rules of the TED conferences, as some of you may have heard from Bruno yesterday. Never take an iPad or an iPhone when you're moderating or giving a TED talk. But I'm going to violate that to read a quote. Every person remembers some moment in their life when they witnessed some injustice, big or small, and they looked away because the consequences of intervening seemed all too intimidating. Now, this is not a quote from a well-known journalist. It's not a quote from anyone who wrote the Bill of Rights or the Constitution of a democratic society. It is, in fact, a quote from a current article in Vanity Fair spoken by Edward Snowden. So we're not going to be talking about Edward Snowden or the fact that he removed classified documents from the National Security Agency, but we are clearly going to have to deal with some of the questions that are related to these actions. And to get us started, I thought I would just ask this panel of esteemed investigative journalism, and not only journalists, but executives who run investigative journalism units, whose bios are in your materials, and please do read them because the work they have done is extraordinary, some of which you'll see and some of which we'll talk about. But I'm just going to ask them off the top now so we can kind of get it out there. Edward Snowden, hero, villain. He called himself post-Terra generation's new hero yesterday. Exactly how do we feel about Edward Snowden? RANEY, I'm going to start with you. RANEY Aronson is the executive producer of the most award-winning documentary investigative series on television, Frontline.
I'm so happy to go first. Thank you. Snowden, I'm not going to tell you what I think about him. What I think is most interesting about Snowden is who came before him. Who are the other people that were inside the NSA, frustrated, asking tough questions, and actually led to what we believe is one of the most significant stories of our time that Snowden really delivered on big time. But I'm curious about the cast of characters around him.
And we're going to hear more about that later. So Diarmaid Jeffries runs the investigative unit at Al Jazeera. He's head of something called investigation programs, and we're going to see some of his work and talk about it later. Edward Snowden, your opinion?
I think he's a hero. I think he brought something incredibly important to the public's attention, and I think most importantly, he did it in a way where he didn't actually give away any real secrets which affected America's national security. There weren't agents, weren't compromised. He told us about something which is very important for us all to know, not just in America, but obviously here in the UK as well.
That's a couple of questions to follow up on there as well. Irina Borogan joins us from Moscow this morning. She's the deputy editor of an online journalism collective called Agentura.ru. Irina.
I think that Edward Snowden is a hero, but unfortunately his revelations gave a good pretext for Russian authorities to put pressure on the internet and to build up so-called sovereign internet. It means border inside Russia on the internet.
And we'll talk more in a moment about the actual actions that have been taken inside Russia in which you do feel his actions might have had some influence. OMOYELE SOWORE is the founder of a group, it's online reporting, it's also television and radio in Nigeria called Sahara Reporters. OMOYELE, your opinion?
I think people cannot be placed within such subjective nouns of that, whether they're heroes or villains. I think Edward Snowden is a man of history, and he came to intervene at a very, very historical period in our lives, and that should be the way he should be treated, you know, to place him in a very, very strategic place in human history.
Paul Steiger, probably known to everyone in this room, currently the executive chairman of ProPublica.
Pat, I'm in violent agreement with what I've heard from my colleagues. I'm not prepared to pin the label of hero on him yet. I'd like to know a little bit more about his motivations and what led to this, but there's no question that the information he revealed has profoundly changed our perspectives on what the US government is doing, what the UK government is doing, and frankly, has changed the relationship of journalists with their sources in government, certainly in the United States. So it's a profound impact.
Mr. Snowden went on to say in that same quote, "But there's a limit to the amount of inequality and inhumanity that each individual can tolerate. I crossed that line and I am no longer alone." So the subject is investigative journalism and the pressures that have come to bear, the political pressures, the economic pressures, as well as the demands of the echo chamber, which is increasingly the source of news and information for so many. The people who are here represent forces in investigative journalism, which many of us, and if not all of us, would agree is a linchpin to an open and democratic society. It's necessary for transparency and accountability, and when it disappears, transparency and accountability and government actions are allowed to exist that can't exist where there is a robust and vital investigative journalism at play. We're going to start the session by looking at the work of Frontline. This is a series that airs on PBS in the United States. We're going to look at this perspective of investigative journalism from as much as possible the worldwide perspective that's represented in this room. But we begin with this story and its implications for investigative journalism and national security. Video clip.
My name is Ed Snowden. The NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default.
The National Security Agency called it the program.
He said, we are under emergency conditions.
Created after 9/11.
Extraordinary means are required to deal with the threat. And then he said, don't ask any more questions.
Collecting data on American citizens.
Anything you hand to a private company is potentially government's.
You're looking for unknown conspirators, and the way they devised to do that was to look at everybody.
This May, Frontline tells the story of secrets at the highest levels of government.
A whole new surveillance program without warrants.
Designed for domestic surveillance. What we're doing is lawful, and I think is effective.
Through 2 presidencies.
George Bush is on the edge of a cliff.
This is a highly classified program that is crucial to our national security.
He wasn't just collecting phone calls, he was collecting the entire internet stream.
No more ignoring the law when it is inconvenient. Obama not only continued, but expanded these programs beyond what the Bush administration did.
Leaks.
The one final choice was to go to the press.
They leak classified information. That's against the law.
The New York Times began to realize they've been lied to by the White House.
Whistleblowers.
Here is this well-level analyst who was able to access 1.7 million documents.
This was a stupendous intelligence breach.
Every intelligence agency in the world is trying to find this guy, find Snowden.
And a challenge to the Constitution.
That's not just innocent data collection. That's digital surveillance.
I argued it was unethical, illegal, and unconstitutional. And when this comes out, all hell is going to break loose.
From Frontline's award-winning investigative teams.
I truly had become an enemy of the state.
A chilling series.
You will have blood on your hands if there's another attack.
About the convergence of government spying.
If the NSA officials are breaking the law, I am going to fry them.
And an information revolution.
We're living behind one-way mirrors. Corporate America and national security state know so much about us, and we know so little about them.
A Frontline special series beginning May 13th on PBS.
Wow.
Stay tuned.
That hasn't aired anywhere yet. That's still rough track, but she still wanted it, so you have it. We'll release this next week.
You call that rough?
That's rough. I see all the, yes, that is, yes.
Okay. So this series, Rainey, obviously has been the result of lots and lots of resources and time and commitment from the Frontline staff, who are all known to be excellent journalists and producers. And there have been millions of words written and hundreds of thousands of hours, it feels like, already on this subject, and it has been less than a year. So what does this add to our understanding of the situation of the Snowden case?
I think that's actually the question we ask anytime Frontline does anything. So it took us a number of months after the story was breaking to figure out what could we add to the story. And I think what we do that is, I wouldn't say that no one's done this. I would say that it hasn't been done in documentary form. So I think it's been written in some cases, is to really look at what was happening inside the NSA post 9/11 in intimate detail. The first 2 hours actually look purely at the Bush era again, but the different lens is truly inside the NSA. We had great cooperation from a number of whistleblowers who were trying their damnedest, frankly, to get the word out. And there's a remarkable amount of material that just has never been known before. And then we really move on to the era that's the current era, the Obama era. And I think that's where the story is that we all need to be paying attention to even more, is what's really happened in this administration, with this administration. What have they done? They're less, in a way, able to talk about it at this point because they're, of course, in power now. So we are working really hard to get the third hour of the series really sharp. We're reporting it right now. And frankly, it's the whole story from the beginning to where we are. And I think that's really important for Americans to know about the context to what you're seeing right now. And sometimes that's what we do best. But we have all these fresh interviews. And so we think it's a fresh effort.
I'm trying to find a way to stay in your sight line and out of the sight lines of the audience, so just tell me to move if I'm too much in it. So just give us an idea of, if not the exact budget of a project like this, but the numbers of journalists. I know you never answer those questions, but how many people are involved in taking this to the next level, which, as you say, there are some things that can be best explored when you have 3 programs, a series, 90 minutes or an hour each?
No, it's actually 3 hours in total. So it's 2 hours the first night, and it's a third hour the next week. So this team is our most veteran team of reporters and investigative journalists. It's Michael Kirk and Martin Smith. And we put them together at certain points when we feel we really need to do the big story. We tend to go big, but this is really big. So 3 hours of television is a big deal. And so they spent the last 9 months really putting their heads together about the political story, but also the corporate story. And clearly, as you guys all know, doing corporate accountability reporting is even harder than government accountability reporting. So we are working really hard right now on that part of the story, and that's Martin's real baby, is to look at corporate accountability in this. But this is a big team. It's a righteous team. It's probably about 10 people in total, really devoted to this, and it's a really big effort. It's probably the biggest effort that Frontline's making for the spring. And we tend to do that. We tend to make big bets once or twice a year. So we've done this before, and it usually ends up having a remarkable effect by doing that.
And you're probably not going to answer this question either, but I have to ask it. What are you expecting us to learn from this way of investigating the story that we don't know now?
I think it's a great question, and I think the better way to answer it is, what did I learn? So what I learned was, and I actually was really looking at the Bush era as something that Frontline's done a lot of. If you're familiar with us, we have really told that story. What was remarkable was telling it from the inside of the NSA. So we all know the Snowden chapter. What we don't know is all of these rumblings, as I said, that were starting to happen, and the people inside and the frustrations they have. The whistleblowers inside the NSA who are desperately trying to right what they felt was a wrong, they are profound. And they are the sort of, I don't know, they're the heroes you don't know, actually, because they were so trying to get the word out. They were so trying not to break rules, but they really felt something was amiss. And this is really their point of view. And that's something I just don't think we've seen. So it's the lens of that era through the NSA. And it was the devastation that they all felt, frankly, that they had missed what happened on 9/11, and what then happened after was really remarkable. So I don't think that's been seen before.
Dear Ahmed, you're listening to these resources, and in fact, working at Al Jazeera, you're one of the few big media companies that's still investing in investigative journalism. I mean, your group is actually growing when in most newsrooms and most media companies, the numbers of people devoted to investigative journalism have clearly been on the decrease. So first of all, why is that the case inside Al Jazeera? And then what are you specifically looking for when you set out to investigate and document?
Well, the two things are related to some extent in that our mission, if we have a mission at Al Jazeera, is to give a voice to the voiceless. That's our catchphrase, our mission statement, if you like. We're a global channel, and we broadcast around the world. We have channels which are specific to some territories, like Al Jazeera America, which is a new one we've just started, and Al Jazeera Balkans is another one. But we have an international channel, which is Al Jazeera English. And crucially, what we try and do is to see things from a different perspective than through the normal transatlantic prism, if you like. Now, investigative journalism is very important to us in that respect, because when we are giving voice to the voiceless, that means we're looking at situations and stories around the world which just don't get covered. And often the only way to expose the way that, for argument's sake, that children working on tobacco farms in Malawi are being abused, or how a community is being destroyed because of some mining in northern Finland, or some abuse that's going on amongst albino children in Tanzania, is to do a good old-fashioned investigation, because there isn't a hinterland of journalism around it to explain some of these stories, and so we have to go in and invent it. So investigative journalism is something that we've had to develop as a very powerful, it's a tool for us. And all our journalism across our bulletins, not just the investigative programs that I run, which are, if you like, specifically investigative, but all of our journalism on our news bulletins tends to have an element of investigation about it, because it meets our mission. So we invest in it because it's part of our core business. And that is why, people watch us, we think, and we have found an audience, we're in 300 million homes around the world, because people come to us for that kind of journalism. They can go elsewhere for other kinds of journalism, but that's our, if you like, our USP.
And what we're going to see is an excerpt from a video you did on the Lockerbie tragedy, and again, going for information that had not been uncovered, that took you some time to uncover in making this?
Just explain quickly, just going into this. This is the third of 3 films that we've made over the course of 3 years. The first 2 looked at the case against the one man convicted of the Lockerbie bombing, which is a guy called Abdul Basit al-Megrahi. And we looked at the case against him. He's always claimed he's dead now, but he claimed until his death that he was innocent, that he was a victim of a miscarriage of justice. So we looked at basically we re-examined the forensic case against him, and we found it to be deeply flawed. We then were left with a question at the end of the second film, which we showed in 2012, which is that, well, if he didn't do it, then who did? So the third film, which is made by someone actually who's also currently now working for Frontline.
We're fighting over him.
Actually, they set out to find the answer to that question. If it wasn't Megrahi and Libya, then who was it? And so this clip basically begins just after an incident. It happened a few months before Lockerbie, when an airliner was shot down.
Good luck.
The Vincennes launched 2 radar-guided missiles. But the Vincennes had not shot down a rocket or a warplane, but an Iranian commercial airliner. The USS Vincennes had killed 290 civilians, among them 66 children. Iran's leaders were convinced that the airliner had been deliberately brought down. They promised vengeance. We must all be prepared for a real war and fight against America and its lackeys.
This is crucial. They thought that if they didn't retaliate against the United States, we would continue to shoot down their civilian airliners. If you don't understand that, you don't understand Lockerbie.
Once a senior Iranian intelligence official, Abul Qasim Mesbahi used to report directly to the Iranian president. In the late 1990s, he defected from Iran and fled to Germany. He now lives in a witness protection program.
The Iranian decided to retaliate as soon as possible. The decision was made by the whole system in Iran, and then confirmed by Ayatollah Khomeini. The target was to copy exactly that's what's happened to the Iranian Airbus. Everything exactly same, minimum 219 people dead. This was the target of the Iranian decision makers.
According to CIA intelligence, Iran's leaders turned to the PFLP-GC.
6 days after taking down the Airbus, there was a meeting in Beirut. We know where it occurred. The Iranians went to the PFLP-GC, the break-off faction, and said, all right, you guys know how to bring down airplanes, bring down five civilian airliners.
The execution of the operation was contracted to Ahmad Jabril, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, PFLP-GC leader. Money was given to Jabril up front in Damascus for initial expenses. The mission was to blow up a Pan Am flight.
When you read the DIA cables, you are seeing a reflection of the intelligence community, the National Security Agency, and the CIA, their best information. This isn't like the DIA's theory of what happened in Lockerbie. They're reflecting the theory of the National Security Agency and the CIA.
The intelligence that we developed is that the Lockerbie bombing was masterminded by Ahmed Jabril, who was the head of the PFLP-GC, and he was supported by Iran.
The man in charge of the operation was a Palestinian called Hafez Qasim Dal-Qamouni.
So, navigating the political stories that are all a part of that, and then the outcome and the impact. Talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah. The interesting thing about this film is that it was Al Jazeera making it. This was a story which had some currency beforehand. We actually got hold of new documents and DIA cables and things to substantiate the story that it was Iran behind the story, but it was one that many people had been familiar with. You can argue about how much evidence there was for it beforehand, but people had known it. But the fact that we were doing this, and we had spent such a huge amount of time and money and effort to dig up the facts, and it was a Middle Eastern-based channel saying this, gave it an extra credence. That also presented us with a series of challenges, because we are a channel which, it's important to stress, we are editorially independent in every respect from the people who fund us, which is the state of Qatar. We are as independent, probably more so, I would argue, than the BBC is from the British government. I know that people may not.
Might get an argument for that.
Yes, sure, of course, but it's something that I want to state. But nevertheless, for us to make a film, Qatar, where I used to work in London until a year ago when we moved our office out to Doha, it's only 100 miles away from Iran. We're surrounded by Arab countries who don't always agree with the kind of things that we do. We are basically saying that a Palestinian organization was responsible for the Lockerbie bombing. Now the political context is very difficult for us, and it involved a huge amount of discussion about how to get this on air. But we did it because we thought it was important, and because in the end the facts were there. And one of the crucial things about investigative journalism is that when you know a story, when you've got the evidence, you can't not put it out there. I'm coming back to Edward Snowden. Once this stuff is out there, and you can't ignore it. You can't walk away from it. And I'm sure this is something that we all have come across. And so that's why we did it. And in terms of its impact, well, hopefully we think maybe one day it'll end in the case against Megrahi being overturned in a court of law, which is where it should be resolved. And I think it will also raise questions as to how it was that he was framed for a crime he didn't commit.
This seems like a good time to remind us all of the dangers, though, of doing investigative reporting. As I'm sure most of you know, there are Al Jazeera reporters in jail in Egypt. They have been in prison for 100 days, actually 103 days. Monday was their anniversary, as it were, and there were unified protests all over the world asking for their safety and release. But doing this kind of work is dangerous, and Irina Borogan certainly knows that, living in Russia now in times when the government has either taken over control of all broadcast media and has now begun to shut down the online news and investigative services, which the Committee to Protect Journalists called last week the last front line of journalism in Russia are the online journalists. And now you and your collective are threatened as well. How would you describe the state of investigative journalism and the government's response?
Unfortunately, I should say that the state of investigative journalism in Russia is not very promising right now. But 15 years ago, every big publications in Moscow had an investigative department, and it was a huge department, and there were a lot of investigations. But a couple of months ago, my colleagues and I decided to count how many investigative journalists we have now in Moscow. And we counted only 6 or 7. Maybe we missed someone, but that's amount. And there have left a few news outlets that can afford to have an investigative department. I can list all of them. It doesn't take a lot of time because it's only 3. This is Political Daily newspaper Vedomosti, Novaya Gazeta, where Anna Politkovskaya used to work, and the Russian Forbes magazines, and even in those media, investigative department consists of 2 or 3 people. My website, Agentura.ru, consists of 2 people. We started our website in 2000, and we have about 10 journalists who were ready to work for us, not on permanent basis, but they were doing a good job. But now there are only 2 of us, my colleague and the chief editor of Agentura.ru, Andrei Soldatov, and me. And I have been covering secret services more than a decade in Russia, and for this period I was forced to change 6 publications, and the last place that was ready to get my story published was Novaya Gazeta, but even Novaya Gazeta got rid of me in 2009. And since then,
when you say got rid of you, you were fired?
I was fired because without substantial explanations, they just said that because of reasons of financial crisis. So I didn't find it substantial. So it was.
Can I ask a question? I mean, Irina, one of the things we all know about Russian journalism, you mentioned Anna before, is that it is very dangerous. If you write something or you publish something in Russia which the government doesn't like, then the retribution can be very bad. The consequences can be very bad. Why do you do it?
The first about consequences. So, if you asked about Anna Politkovskaya, I was fired from Novaya Gazeta after publishing an investigation on her killings, and I revealed the information. I was tasked to reveal the information by the editorial board. Was tasked to reveal the information about the role of the FSB colonel, the secret agent of the FSB, who was involved, some way involved in some preparations to her killings. And the story was published, and I was fired, and was the end of the whole story, because he was freed after 2 weeks, and so that's the consequences, that's the retributions. The authorities had not to do something.
But you still carry on.
Why I carry on? Because I put into the subjects a lot of efforts. I put into the subjects too much. I have been covering this topic since 2000, and including the hostage taken in Moscow theater and the Beslan tragedy, and I published a lot of investigations on the secret sources. I just want to give up. I just don't want to give up.
I was going to say, you don't want to give up. I suspect she does it for the same reason you do, Dermot, and everyone else who's here, because how else does sometimes the truth of the real story get told?
Yeah.
And it's particularly important in a place like Russia now, where there are so few sources of free or open or uncontrolled or manipulated information, and where the echo chamber has all the more power as a result. And Nigeria was another country beset with corruption and all kinds of exploitations and injustices that were not being reported by the Nigerian press. And OMOYELE saw this and decided that something had to be done, and put together a collective called the Sahara Reporters, received some funding originally from Piero Midiar and others who supported this effort for someone to tell the stories. And OMOYELE, would you also talk about how you tell the stories? Because the question about Irina and the safety issue is one that you had to face very early on. Could you do this kind of work inside Nigeria? And the answer was no. Yes?
No. I do this. I have to say very importantly that I have no journalism background at all, and that is why I respect those who are not professionally journalists, who risk their lives to be on the front lines, to tell stories that otherwise can never have been told. And one of the things that needs to be known by everybody who is doing this is that, the moment you cross that line, the line shifts again. And that's very important that we do what we do. But I decided on telling the story about Nigeria in a very, very different way. I actually use citizens to tell stories by collecting information and curating it in New York and then republishing it. One of our most important work was actually took place here in the UK. There was a Niger Delta governor in Nigeria that stole money from Nigeria, money that belongs to hospitals, schools, and bought mansions in the UK, London. And we found out about this mansion one day, took the address to the land registry in the UK, bought the address, and sent somebody down there to take a picture of the house, but it was a gated community. So we had to have this guy, who I'm meeting later tonight, go back and buy a mechanic overall, and he pressed the bell and they let him in. And here was sitting in his garage, a brand new Bentley that he had bought, never used before. And we followed this governor for 5 years, reporting on every move he made. He was charged for corruption in Nigeria. The judges took bribe and let him go. He ran to Dubai. He was arrested and extradited to the UK, and he's spending 13 years in jail as we speak in the UK. The most important thing about him that he used to work at a store called Wiki's here. Yes, as a cashier. And but now he's richer than the entire store, having stolen immensely from Nigeria. But the reason why we do this is that corruption destroys people the same way war destroys people. And we believe that governments hate interaction. And one of the things that we did in our own publication is to bring people to interact and discuss the issues about corruption. It's not about just talking heads giving you stories, but we have brought new participants in the media business, and they are commentators. They are the social media people who take it and run away with it, and have been able to force the Nigerian government to change its way. You know, we've sent this governor to jail here. Recently, we got a minister fired in Nigeria because she bought 2 BMWs for $1.6 million instead of $300,000. It took 4 months of constantly reminding people about her atrocity before she was fired, because she was a girlfriend to the president of Nigeria. So these are some of the things we've done. I'm not in any way comparable to what this great gentleman.
No, you are.
Exactly.
No, you are.
What do you mean? We've got a minister fired, you ended a government.
That's what we call a result.
Yeah.
You know.
So, but I just want to say, you know, like you mentioned that each time you see an individual move out to take the risk, there are 200 others struggling to decide whether they should or not. You know, for those ones, they will be heroes too, but you know, they just not have made as much impact as people who step out and say, I don't give a damn. We have to change the way things work.
Right.
Yeah.
Before going to you, Paul, I want to go, Darren, and I hope I can bring you into this, because you gave a testimony before the House of Lords in 2011, I think, in which you questioned the value of citizen journalists, the kind of journalism actually that OMOYELE has set up, and that was 2011. One can change their mind. I'm just wondering how you feel.
Well, to be fair to me, just to
yes, trying to be. Yes.
Okay. Well, what I was questioning was you know, the raw footage gathered in the middle of a demonstration, standing as the whole story of that demonstration. That was the context in which I was putting it. I think this sort of citizen journalism, I think, is fantastic. I think, as we've seen in Syria now, quite often people will go and shoot the aftermath of a bomb going off or an explosion, and you don't know who was responsible. And that can be used by whoever gets hold of that video to put forward all sorts of arguments. So all I'm saying is that you need a degree of it being curated, if you like, and you need some way in which it can be filtered and its provenance can be sorted out, because otherwise you can't necessarily trust it. So that's just the point I was making, really. But I think this sort of journalism, where people become empowered to go investigate things themselves, I think is fantastic and should be applauded.
You need both. You need you need professional journalists to do certain kinds of work, and you need people who are on the scene, that the technology now makes it possible for them to bear witness in ways that could not have happened before. Yeah.
So Paul, you speak of that from many different perspectives, a long career in journalism in many different positions, and at one point, not long ago, saying the only way for investigative journalism to thrive as you wanted it to thrive was to move it into the nonprofit arena, where there were others who were doing that, to organizations in this room, as a matter of fact. But ProPublica has defined in many people's minds how to take an enterprise like investigative journalism and make it sustainable. Can you talk about the challenges that you now are facing as well as the opportunities you pursued?
Sure. I mean, I think first of all, ProPublica is just a piece of the solution. And what we're finding now is that we've come through a period in which the old platforms, which were dominant for my entire career until very recently, have been totally disrupted by the new technology, the technology of the web. And some things that were possible and indeed financially easy for my years at the Los Angeles Times and the Wall Street Journal are now much more difficult, if not impossible. Investigative reporters have been laid off from traditional institutions all across the United States, and we're seeing this starting to spread into Europe as well, as traditional newspapers and to some extent, although it's different, on television are facing much tighter budgets, and so the sort of the echo chamber that your title refers to is definitely going on in those places. But at the same time, what is happening is new forms, and ProPublica and the Center for Public Integrity and the Center for Investigative Reporting in the US are examples of one way to approach this, which is to say that investigative reporting is a public good. Democracy can't operate without it, and exposing corruption, whether in business or government or the healthcare system or the legal system, is a crucial way of keeping democracy fresh. And if the private market will not supply this, and which in the old format it won't, then philanthropy is a perfectly viable way to get it, just as philanthropy supports museums and it supports certain kinds of hospitals, and it supports universities all across the United States and elsewhere in the world. There are other sources springing up. The technology enables you to do stuff that you could not have done anywhere near as well without it. Some of the new entrants into journalism, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, which people thought of as cat videos. Well, they just stole one of my best editors and have given him the budget to hire 6 investigative reporters. So the world is changing. We are finding ways to restore and even enhance this important contribution. It needs support from the philanthropy sector, which is why I'm glad to be here. And it also needs one more thing, because the biggest threat right now is the increased targeting of journalists for physical violence and murder. This is when I was a kid, journalists were granted safe conduct. They could go among insurgencies, and sometimes they would get killed, but it was because they were caught in a crossfire. Now you have journalists deliberately targeted. I had a dear reporter kidnapped and murdered so that somebody could do a propaganda video showing him being killed. I mean, the world has changed. In Russia, how many since Putin came to power? 19 or 20 journalists have been murdered, and only 1 prosecution. Am I right?
Yeah.
That has to stop, and it's there's no magic answer to doing it, but I think it's a very important thing that not just journalists, but the general public should be aware of.
So that's a good point in which to open to all of us, because we are the ones consuming the media, and we are the ones who are either benefiting or are not from the challenges that have been mentioned and the good work that's been shown. So let's have some questions. We do want to move to the changes that have come because of disruptive technologies and technologies that empower new kinds of investigative reporting. Here's a mic and there's a mic, so questions? There's one right there, and then we'll come here.
Yeah, hi, Ben Wers with Knight Foundation. I was just curious, there was reference to the way that the Snowden revelations has changed the Russian government's attitude towards the internet, and I was wondering if we could just kind of follow up on that, because I'm not familiar with that story at all.
Irina?
Yes. You know that Edward Snowden is under strict control in Russia. It is the control of the FSB, and it's absolutely clear. And we have no access to him. I mean, Russian journalist. He refused to give an interview to Russian journalists. Even refused to give interview to state media, pro-Kremlin media. And he is a very very precious guy for the Kremlin, because his revelations about the NSA surveillance on all kinds of communications around the world give Russian authorities a huge explanation for changing legislation in the country. Every legal initiative in Russia, in the parliament or with the government, started with reference to Edward Snowden's revelations, and they are now authorities going to build some kind of borders around Russian internet. It sounds like an absurd, but it's really true. And what are my main concerns? That they try to replace the internet services that now are really mostly on the territory of the United States to the Russian soil. And what does it mean? It means that if they would be successful, but they would be all information on social networks and foreign websites, and a lot of foreign websites could be accessible for the system of interception in Russia, and could be accessible for any violation from the Russian authorities. So.
Good question. Over here.
Hi, thank you for the interesting conversation. Ed Zieski from Instead, and we build technology for social purposes, including journalists. And the Snowden revelations of the sort of arsenal and toolkits that the NSA has at its disposal made me want to ask you a question about how technology could be used. If you could have that same arsenal and everything we imagine as 22nd century investigative journalism technology at your fingertips today, would you use it, and how would you use it?
Excellent question. Why doesn't everybody? Paul, do you want to start?
Well, I think that it's hard to make the case the government should have as much access as the NSA has been taking about the private conversations, or even to whom people are talking. You know, one can plausibly argue that there are certain kinds of national security contexts which would make that a requirement. I think for private citizens, whether they're journalists or not, to have access to that kind of information with all the gossip that goes on in my newsroom, I just don't think I would want that to take place. Fine as part of a court proceeding, but for journalists to have access willy-nilly to the private conversations of ordinary citizens, I think that would be a bad idea.
I mean, there's all the court cases going on. There was all the fuss here in the UK last year and the year before about the phone tapping scandals, you know, the tabloid newspapers going after the private lives of individuals, and which is essentially exactly the same thing. So I think it's not justifiable for journalists to have these tools or to make use of them, and there's no substitute for good old-fashioned hard work, really. There are a lot of bad guys out there, and we won't necessarily catch them or expose them all, but you can't just throw out a big fishing net and hope to catch everybody.
Right.
I agree. I mean, I really agree with both of them. I just, one caveat. We just did a film on SAC and the insider dealings that were happening in the FBI through means that we think were actually warrant search. They were able to record the conversations happening, and we did use those in a film, and they were legitimate recordings of these conversations that really did prove that insider trading was happening. So I think through legitimate means, absolutely, we should be exposing those kind of conversations if there's been a warrant and it's justifiable. But I agree with both of them.
No, absolutely. It's part of a government investigation. It's part of the evidence.
Important, right.
Go for it.
Follow up on that from anyone? So, OMOYELE, can I just, no, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, thank you for an excellent panel. I was educated to refine my thinking as I'm taking the other side. Can you think of examples where this investigative journalism can actually hurt citizens, where the transparency and this type of breaking news that we're talking about can actually create a damage rather than not?
I'll just answer that. I do think that the conversation, the corollary to what Paul was talking about, is the treatment of whistleblowers. And I don't actually think when a whistleblower comes forward and wants to talk to us, I think it's really contingent upon us as journalists to make sure we're treating our sources with real sensitivity to what could happen. We're very educated at this point about what could happen, especially recently. And I think there is a conversation. That's a really great question. We could talk about it after. It's how you treat either confidential sources or sources who want to not be confidential. It's the kind of conversation that you have with sources about, do you understand the ramifications of talking to us on camera in my medium, and what that could mean to you in your personal life, your professional life. And sometimes we find with sources that they actually they haven't considered it fully. And that's the role of a really responsible journalist, I think, or producer in our case, to say to them, please consider what you're about to do because your life will never be the same. I think the other side of that coin is questions that are asked to us as journalists constantly. Well, will you actually go to jail to hide our confidentiality? And answering that question as a journalist, it is a tough one at this stage of the game because it's very real. When you look at people like James Risen and others, it's a very real threat right now. So I do think people can get hurt, but I think it's on us to help sources think through their actions.
Sufficient? Question
Sufficient, yeah.
Yeah, hi. My name's James Fawn. I'm the director of the Earth Journalism Network and a journalism lecturer at UC Berkeley. And actually, I'm glad you just mentioned the James Risen case. That's what I wanted to ask about is, for those not familiar, the Obama administration is prosecuting James Risen, an investigative journalist from the New York Times, requiring him to testify in court as to the source of his leak. And I believe that's not the only case they're prosecuting. I think and I'm wondering, particularly in the US, is this having a chilling effect on investigative journalism and whether this is an issue in other countries as well? Thank you.
I mean,
yes, it is. It happens. It's happening more often. I mean, I don't want to go on about my colleagues in Egypt particularly, but nonetheless, we have 3 journalists there right now who just have spent 103 days in prison for just basically being there and reporting in a normal news way what was going on after the overthrow of Morsi. And for that, the government took revenge on them and is accusing them of spurious, absurd kind of terrorism offences, which they're making up just as an excuse to keep them in, presumably just to stop other journalists working. So it's all part of a pattern. It's happening more and more often, partly because I think journalism is in a way becoming quite effective these days. There's a lot more journalism around. I mean, one of the things that a few years ago used to hear was that investigative journalism was dying out. And I know there have been reductions in budgets and things, but nonetheless, it is finding, it's like mercury. It will find its way through the cracks out there to the public. And it's doing so in ways which is beginning to threaten powerful bodies and governments and things who are vulnerable to it, to some extent.
The Obama administration has been pursuing more leak investigations than all the previous presidents put together. I mean, part of it is the environment that you're citing, and part of it is they have better tools for pursuing it.
Yeah.
In the technology, the technology giveth and the technology taketh
Right,
away.
the flip side.
Do they not know his source? That's the interesting question. Is that the thing about the NSA is that they had all this information. They don't seem to have made much use of it. Presumably they know who he is already. I mean.
Bruno, you had a question?
Yes. I worked at the TED conference, and 2 weeks ago we had both Ed Snowden and Rick Ledgett, the deputy director of the NSA, live on stage at our conference. And we asked the public, the audience in the theater, a version of the hero versus traitor question regarding Snowden. And about half of the audience went for the hero, about 20% went for the traitor, and the others remained silent. And that was really interesting to me, because it means that there is a lot of ambiguity in how do we react to whistleblowers, not only of his level and scope, but in more in general. And I wonder whether that ambiguity applies also to a lot of investigative journalism. How do people react to the kind of stories that, to the frontline story that you're about to put out? Is the last 15 years of diminishing resources in newsrooms, has it corresponded with a diminished attention and credibility of those newsrooms? And do we need to rebuild from there as well? So it seems that in the cacophony, somehow the relevance and the credibility of investigative journalism has also been lost, the same way the credibility of governments has been lost and of intelligence agencies has been lost. We're kind of all in a similar situation, and it becomes very murky.
I would just say that one of the biggest pressures on Frontline right now is increasingly in visual form. We're one of the only places that's doing investigative journalism, and so we feel internally at Frontline a great deal of responsibility and pressure to get it right at all times. We always did. I think the increased pressure is that we need to really fortify this series and the idea of this type of long-form investigative journalism. It's tough and it's really important, so that's what the fire underneath us. The response to Frontline is huge right now, and again, my guess is increasingly because we do multi-platform work, so it's going out across platforms, but also because there's so little of this happening in the form that we're doing. A lot of your work we can't even see in America anymore, which is, we were just talking about, a great loss when we lost Al Jazeera on Link TV. So we're really looking at how do we fortify ourselves and focus increasingly on the funding behind our investigative journalists as opposed to our production stream. And that's complicated and sort of inside baseball, but it's how we're thinking right now. How do we continue to look at what really needs to be funded? And that tends to be what's more expensive, which is the investigative journalism.
Can I just bring OMOYELE into this just a moment to give us a sense of how the Nigerian public reacts to your investigations, because I think some of those same questions that are being raised now around the Snowden case around the world have come about on some of your investigations. So especially since you run the operation out of New York and not Nigeria, how is all of that working out?
Well, when we started, it was disbelief in the public, because naturally, as you always notice, people want great journalists to be great investigative sources. And when they saw bricklayers and carpenters like us doing the work, they just couldn't believe it, because here they have all the big guys, with their suit and their big laptops and newsrooms, sitting on all these stories, and we're breaking them beneath them. But it was well received, But of course, we had a lot of pushback. For example, I was sued 3 times in New York. In the US. by entities close to the Nigerian government, because we're reporting also on fraud going on in the embassies. And each time you mention a U.S. lawyer involved, he sues you because the Nigerian government goes behind him. So I was sued 3 times, and I was exposed to the U.S. legal system. But I must say to all of you that the greatest danger to press freedom is governments. I'm telling you, it doesn't matter whether it's the U.S. government, UK government, or some shadow government somewhere. Governments just don't like to be exposed. And the important thing is for journalists to understand that it's not going to be a piece of cake. It's not going to be welcoming. It's not going to be receptive. It's not going to be popular to do the kind of thing we do. And we are not always going to be safe. As a matter of fact, the more impact your work have on society, the less safe you become as a source of providing sunlight and sunshine in the dark areas of government. But it's also been rewarding for us in the sense that we've been appreciated by the Nigerian people, and even outside of Nigeria, people appreciate the kind of work we do. We not only go after the Nigerian government, by the way, we go after corporations like Chevron, Shell. All of them are part of the international conspiracy and corruption that is part of the problem that we are all discussing here. And finally, I just want to say, by repeating what everybody knows, that journalism is more important work for us to leave it to journalists to do by themselves. So people have to be vigilant and become journalists themselves for us to bring down the wall of oppression that keeps all of us in an open prison in this world, because governments don't just want you to know how they operate. And we must know, and we must make sure we find out.
Can you safely go to Nigeria?
No, I do go to Nigeria because I had, after doing this work, I had to create my own airport near to Nigeria.
How much should it cost?
That you can follow up there, investigative journalists.
And that's what they call disruptive technology.
But you raised some questions that Bruno was referencing too. Is it the public too, which is being served by this, but there's a level of skepticism and distrust that's arisen. I don't know if that's where you're going with your question, but whatever it is.
Almost. It's a question more for OMOYELE, but I'm sure Irina and the others might want to chip in as well on this. Journalists like to compete with each other and make sure that our paper or our news organisation gets the story first. But one of the great advantages we have for our stories is that if they make an impact, everyone else follows on. And I wonder whether you have this problem increasingly in Russia and in Nigeria, where there aren't enough others to follow on. In Nigeria a few years ago, there was a wonderful new newspaper called Next, which broke some great stories, but then those stories went nowhere. They dropped a pebble in a pond, and there were no ripples because no one else followed it up. And I wonder whether this was a struggle for you with the work that you're doing, trying to get other news organisations in Nigeria, and I guess as the space closes in Russia, other news organisations in Russia to actually follow up your stories so they become part of the broader conversation.
Good. Thank you for the question. OMOYELE?
Well, our first greatest problem and enemies were the Nigerian media, the established media. They just wouldn't accept that we have a right to even publish in the first place. And that was the problem Next faced. But there was something we did that none of them did, because we recognized this very early. We gave ownership of our stories to ordinary people because we sourced it from them. So social media became one of our most powerful means of distribution of news. And I would say, I've never met the Next guy before, but one thing I wanted to tell him when he came was the fact that the traditional means of distribution wasn't going to work. He was, buying printing press and, a lot of acres of newspapers. But, at that time, newspapers had moved to a different level, which was digital, and we used that extensively. I mean, we have like 800,000 fans on Facebook. We have about, 250,000 followers on Twitter. And they are very active. This is organic, means of distribution of news. And I think what has not happened is that the same Nigerian traditional media practitioners, as they love to call themselves, who rejected us at the beginning, now lash on our stories. In fact, they use our stories as excuses for writing their own story. Because, you know, the big men will call them and say, why did you write about me? Oh, we saw it on Sahara Reporters, sir. You know, and of course, it's very difficult to catch Sahara Reporters. But it's easy to catch them because they are all within the same space.
Right. So, Irina, I would think that you are also worried a bit about the lack of public outcry in Russia about all this. I mean, ultimately, journalism, this kind of journalism, is serving the public. Why isn't the public rising up and saying, you know, the media, we need open and free, or at least somewhat access to information that's being denied? Are you seeing that?
That's true, because sometimes we haven't got proper reaction from the public on our publications and even investigation. For example, journalists and mostly bloggers exposed a big investigation on the corruption at the Sochi Olympic Games, but everybody knows in Russia that these games cost $50 billion, but a few people care about that because people think that it's honest price for Russian pride. I think it's consequences of post-totalitarian era and the difficult era of 1990s when many people in Russia was poor and lost their Soviet ground and didn't find the new so the situation. And the same reaction. Have I a minute? Can I continue?
Yes, of course.
And the same strange and weird reaction from the public my co-author Andrei Soldatov and I had after we exposed a total surveillance system at the Sochi Olympic Games, where all kinds of electronic communications was intercepted by the secret services, and there were a lot of drones overhead and CCTV cameras around the city. But people, it's cost a lot of money, a huge amount of money, but people wasn't aware of it, and they wasn't very nervous about it because they decided that it's normal to prevent some terrorist attack. But it wasn't organized against terrorists, but people were satisfied.
You did see me look at my watch because we are coming to the end of our time together, or at least I think that's right. I'm seeing nodding heads. So we won't be able to take the rest of the questions, but I would like the panelists to sum up a bit, because when putting this together, the Skoll World Forum thought, you know, this is not just a session for journalists or for people who really are deeply committed to investigative journalism as a way of life, but this is a subject of deep importance to each and every one of us as a citizen and wherever we might live, because without investigative journalism and the transparency and accountability that brings, there can be no social progress, and that is, after all, why we're all here, in the hopes that can go forward. So just in final thoughts about the importance of what you do, but why does it matter so much? And is there one thing that you would say or do to an audience of people who are devoted to social progress that makes that point again? Just one more opportunity to make the case for vibrant investigative journalism represented by this panel. Paul, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think I've seen over the years investigative reporting rescue children that were being abused in horrible ways. I've also seen it bring down, or in other cases, simply chasten great corporations. One of the greatest businessmen of the past century, Steve Jobs, spent 40 minutes yelling at me over the phone because we had caught them, along with other people in Silicon Valley, misbehaving in the way that they were dealing with their options. And it has, this kind of work has two levels of success. One is the immediate success, the story that you write. But the other thing that it does that I think is so important to democratic societies is that it reminds people of their duties and obligations and that somebody's watching. And so things that in the presence of strong investigative reporting would not be tried, would not even be thought about. Now, in places where it's disappeared, they start to get thought about again.
OMOYELE?
In my lifetime, I saw, particularly in Africa, two revolutions, in Tunisia and Egypt. I don't know how to classify Libya. But one of the things I say in doing this work is that when you do investigative reporting, the type that stirred up anger against governments of those countries, doing it, because we keep doing it, others are reminded that such revolutions are possible.
Irina, final thoughts?
I think that investigative journalism is a fascinating and interesting job, and it's very inspiring to find the truth that other people try to hide. For me.
20 years ago this week was the anniversary of the Rwanda genocide, and where almost 1 million people were killed in 100 days. The reasons for that genocide and why the international community didn't do anything about it, and how it was stopped, and why it should never happen again. In the end, sometimes it's about really simple questions, and those are the sort of questions that's what journalism should be about. I was just struck by it this week because I was looking. That was a failure. We failed. Journalism failed. The signs of that, of what was about to happen in Rwanda, were very obvious, and we didn't do anything about it.
Thank you for that reminder. RANEY, final word to you.
And now I'm the final word. I just, actually a couple of years ago at TED, Bruno, it's interesting, I kept wondering why weren't people alarmed at the numbers of journalists who had lost their jobs? If you look at the numbers, they're astounding. It's something like the 12,000 figures of mid-sized and local newspapers. People have lost their jobs, a lot of which are investigative journalists. And I kept wondering why, and I realized, and I don't know, and I swear, I really wish I knew who said this. What occurred to me is that corruption doesn't show its face, right? So when journalists disappear, nobody notices because the actual work of uncovering corruption isn't happening. So my thought is we have to keep on it. And I agree with all of you. We just have to keep on it and keep vigilant. And then people will understand why journalism matters.
It would be easier to make pets with Tourette's, or cats with hats, or all these things.
Yes, right.
But we don't do that. So.
Well, I want to thank you very much for reminding us in very bold and vivid ways why journalism matters to all of us. Would you join me in thanking them?